The wind shrieked down from the mountains, not like weather, but like a warning. Something was coming. And Clara Halstead was in its path. A single oil lantern flickered in Dry Post Station, where a woman sat still as stone. Snow piled against the weathered siding of the old depot, collecting in soft, smothering drifts. The tracks leading east were buried, the westbound train long since passed, swallowed by the blizzard. Silence pressed hard against the station walls, broken only by the moan of winter slipping through cracks in the planks. Clara Rose Halstead sat on a crooked bench beside the ash-coal stove, which had long since gone cold, her gloved hands wrapped around a leather satchel that bore the scars of travel and survival. Inside the bag were the remains of a life lost, a faded nurse's certificate tied with a ribbon, a pair of steel surgical shears rake-upped in cloth, and an old photograph where her face smiled younger beside a family she no longer spoke of. She hadn't eaten since sunrise. There were only a few coins sewn into the hem of her coat, and no more credit at the boarding house. She'd asked. They'd said no. That had been before the snow started. She hadn't planned to come this far west, but shame had a way of pulling a person away from their roots like a weed. And Clara had been yanked hard from the quiet order of St. Margaret's Infirmary in St. Louis. She had been a nurse with promise, the kind who didn't flinch at blood or death. But men didn't much like a woman who said no, especially when that man was a respected doctor with wealthy family ties, especially when her refusal ended with him on the floor, blood on his collar and a shattered porcelain bedpan beside him. They didn't ask her side. They didn't want it. So she had run. The station's only lamp flickered again, casting strange shadows across the floor. Her breath curled like smoke in the air, and she clutched the satchel closer to her chest. Outside, the world was white, howling, endless. She had stopped shivering some time ago, maybe an hour, maybe longer. Her fingers had gone stiff, and her lips were cracked. The last train east had pulled out before sundown. The next wouldn't come until morning, if the tracks cleared, if she lived that long. A sound interrupted the howl not of wind, but of hooves on frozen ground. At first, she thought she imagined it, but it grew louder, steady, purposeful. From the swirl of snow emerged a figure tall, broad-shouldered, riding a dark stallion with flared nostrils and steam rising from its back. The man wore a heavy duster, its hem stiff with ice, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He dismounted with the ease of someone who'd spent years in the saddle, tying the reins to a post half buried in snow before stepping toward the door. The door creaked open, and a burst of cold rushed inside with him. Evening. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep, with the warmth of a fire kept low, and a touch of Texas in the vowels. Mighty cold night to be sittin' out here alone. Clara looked up, tried to speak, but her teeth chattered too hard for words. She managed a slight nod. The man stepped closer, studying her with sharp but not unkind eyes. His coat was trimmed in real wool, and his boots, polished despite the snow, marked him as a man of means. But he didn't look at her with the appraisal she was used to. He looked concerned. "I'm Weston Boone," he said, removing his gloves. "Own the Bar C Ranch, 20 miles north. Was heading home from town when I saw someone through the station window." He paused, noticing the satchel beside her. "You a doctor?" Clara managed. "Nurse. Name?" "Clara Halstead." His brow lifted, just slightly. "Well, Miss Halstead, trained nurses are rarer than gold in this part of the territory. Most folks around here are lucky if the local barber can stitch a wound without passing out. You're gonna freeze to death if you stay here much longer. This depot ain't got a proper stove, and the wind's coming down hard from the pass." She looked at him, unsure. Desperation warred with dignity. "I don't have money for a hotel," she whispered. "That's not your concern right now." He unfastened his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The heat of it startled her. It smelled of saddle leather, pine soap, and something faintly smoky, tobacco maybe, or charred cedar. "Getting you warm and fed is what matters. We can sort the rest later." She tried to stand, but her knees buckled beneath her. Without hesitation, he caught her, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. "I've got you," he said. Her medical bag hung from his forearm as he stepped back into the storm, cradling her close, her cheek pressed against his collarbone. And for a moment, Clara closed her eyes and let herself be held. The snow didn't bite so sharply now. The wind didn't seem quite so cruel. She didn't know this man, but something in his tone, his steadiness, made her believe he wasn't the kind to take advantage. Or so she prayed. Across the street, a warm orange light glowed behind heavy windows. The Cattleman's Hotel. Its doors opened at Weston's approach, and every eye in the lobby turned toward them as he stepped inside. Mr. Boone, Sir, the desk clerk, a wiry man with thinning hair, nearly dropped his ledger. "What happened?" "Found this lady at the train station," Weston said, still holding her, near frozen. "Need your best room. Send up hot food, coffee and blankets. If Doc Weller's still in town, send for him." "Yes, sir, right away." "Room 12, the clerk added, reaching for a brass key. "Shall I carry her up?" "I've got her." The room on the second floor was already warm from the fireplace, the scent of cinnamon and pine cones drifting from a kettle on the hearth. Clara was gently set on a padded chair by the fire, while Weston added logs, coaxing the flames higher. "I asked him to send up some women's clothes," he said without looking at her. "Yours'll be wet through. We'll get you warm first." There was a knock, and a bellboy entered with a tray coffee, thick soup, blankets. Weston took it, tipped the boy without ceremony, and poured a cup with a steady hand. He wrapped a woolen blanket around Clara's shoulders and passed her the cup. "Drink slow. Too much heat too quick's not good when you're that cold." The warmth slid down her throat like sunlight in winter. "You seem to know a bit about medicine," she said, her voice steadier. "You learn what you need on a ranch," he replied. "Men get hurt, animals get sick, and the nearest doc's usually 100 miles away. But I ain't a nurse." He sat across from her, watching the fire. Silence stretched, comfortable and unsure all at once. "I was a nurse back in St. Louis," Clara said, quietly. "Worked at St. Margaret's, until there was trouble." Weston didn't press, just nodded. "A doctor there," she continued. "Tried something. I fought back. They called it insubordination. I was dismissed. No hospital would take me on after." He turned his head then, his jaw tight. "He forced himself on you. He tried, and you stopped him. I broke his nose with a bedpan." A slow grin spread across Weston's face. "Good. It cost me everything." He nodded again. "Out here, we judge by actions, not gossip. A nurse's skill can mean the difference between life and death. I could use someone like you." She looked at him, eyes wary. "Why are you helping me?" He met her gaze. "Maybe because I know what it means to be alone. Maybe because I've been praying someone like you'd come along." "Someone like me? A healer," he said simply. "I've lost men who might have lived if we'd had someone trained. But more than that." He stood, moving toward the door. I've been looking for someone with courage, someone who'd rather break a man's nose than let him take what ain't his. He opened the door but paused. Rest. Miss Halstead. We'll talk more come morning. And then he was gone, leaving only the warmth of the fire and the sound of wind scratching against the window panes. She didn't know this man, nor his true intentions, but as she leaned into his warmth, something old stirred fear, perhaps, or hope. She would find out by morning. By morning. The blizzard had retreated like a thief in the night, leaving behind silence, frost, and second chances. The windows of room 12 glowed faintly with the milky light of early winter sun. Icicles hung like daggers from the porch eaves, and a thin veil of mist rose from the rooftops of Gallows Creek as the snow began its slow surrender. From her bed, Clara Halstead could see the ghost of her own breath curl into the air, but it was no longer the icy gasp of survival. It was calm, measured, almost restful. She turned her face to the small bedside table where a breakfast tray sat, still steaming. Eggs, bacon, a golden biscuit drizzled with honey, and a mug of coffee so strong it seemed to shimmer. And next to it, a folded woolen dress of deep plum with lace trim, not new, but clean and warm. Another act of kindness she hadn't asked for, yet somehow needed. The coat was gone. Weston Boone must have taken it when she'd fallen asleep, but the scent of pine and saddle soap still lingered faintly in the room. She let her fingers drift across the quilt, tracing patterns that reminded her of a simpler life-checkered cloth. Hand-stitched corners, probably made by someone with quiet hopes and a good deal of patience. It made her think of her mother, though she hadn't thought of her in a long while. Too much water had passed under that bridge. Too many things never spoken. There was a knock at the door, followed by the unmistakable scrape of boots on polished floorboards. She sat up straighter. "Come in," she called, smoothing the blanket. Weston entered, balancing another tray with practiced ease, the scent of fresh coffee rising behind him. "Mornin'," he said. And when he smiled, it was a small thing like the sunrise just peeking over the rim of the earth. Figured you'd be hungry. Clara looked at the untouched breakfast by her bed, then back at the man standing in her doorway, eyes steady, coat dusted with melting frost. "You brought both?" she asked, arching a brow. "Didn't trust the boy not to spill it," he said, setting it down beside the first. She hesitated. "You didn't have to. You don't owe me thanks," Weston said gently, pulling up a chair across from the bed. "Just figured we might talk, if you're feeling up to it." She nodded, reaching for the coffee. It warmed her fingers in a way she hadn't expected to miss. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Then Mr. Boone." Weston. Weston. His name felt strange in her mouth, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. "I'm not sure how to repay your kindness." He leaned back slightly, studying her. "Don't believe repayment's necessary, but I do want to talk about what you plan to do next." Clara paused, the coffee halfway to her lips. What was her plan? "I was hoping," she said slowly, "to find work in one of the mining towns. I heard they sometimes need medical help, but I don't know how to get there, or who would even consider hiring me." He nodded, considering. "Mining camps are rough," he said. "Most of those men haven't seen a proper lady in months. Can't say their manners are anything to brag about." "I can take care of myself," she said, not boastfully, just truth. "I'm sure you can." He tapped a finger against the armrest of his chair, but there might be a better way. She looked up. "My ranch bar C covers over 50,000 acres. I keep about 60 men on payroll year-round. During roundup, closer to 100. And all of them manage to cut, bruise, break, or burned something regular as clockwork. Clara's eyes narrowed with curiosity. Are you offering me work? He nodded. A position as our nurse. Good pay. Your own cabin. Stocked kitchen. Medical room. Whatever supplies you need. Nothing owed. No charity. Just honest work. For honest pay. Her heart fluttered not from nerves, but disbelief. It sounded too good. And in her experience, things that sounded too good usually were. What would you expect in return? She asked. Weston's gaze didn't waver. Do your job. Tend the men when they're hurt. Help when we've got difficult births with livestock. Teach the boys some basics. That's all. He paused, then added, if anything personal developed between us, it'd be mutual, not a condition. Never would be. She blinked, caught off guard by the frankness. She'd known men to be forward, entitled, dishonest, but this was something else. He meant every word, and not in the way men usually claimed to. She set down her mug. How far is your ranch? 20 miles north, he said. Bar C. After my initials, Weston Calder Boone. We raise cattle and horses. Hard work, but good land. The winters bite. Summers get hot. Nearest town is a full day's ride. And I'd be the only woman. Mostly, he said. Tom Bradley's wife passed last year. Only woman on the place now is Cookie's wife Martha, helps in the kitchen. She'd be glad for the company. Clara looked down at her hands. They were strong hands, steady, capable, and calloused enough to match any man's pride. You said you've been looking for a healer, she said. Why haven't you hired someone before? He let out a humorless chuckle. Put out notices from Kansas City to Denver. But most doctors want towns with private patients and plush parlors. Don't want to muck about with cattle hands or ride out into a blizzard for a fevered ranch boy. She smiled, slightly. But you'd hire a woman. I'd hire anyone with the guts and the skills, Weston said. Out here. Don't matter if you wear pants or petticoats. Clara sat in silence, weighing the offer. It wasn't just the money, though that mattered. It was the idea of waking up with purpose again, of having patients who needed her, of not flinching every time someone asked where she came from. What aren't you telling me? She asked, leveling him with her gaze. He smiled a slow, appreciative thing. You're smart. He shifted. All right. Truth is, Bar C ain't a fancy estate. It's work. It's sweat. And you'll be alone some days. Lonely. Even dangerous if someone rides in with bad intentions. I've been lonely in cities packed full of people, Clara said. At least ranch loneliness would be honest. He nodded. And one more thing. My family has money. My father did well in shipping before the war. I've invested smart. Some folks might say you're chasing a wealthy husband. She raised her chin. Let 'em say what they want, she replied. I know who I am. Weston leaned forward slightly. I believe you do. Outside the window, sunlight broke through the clouds and danced on the fresh snow. When would you want me to start? His face lit up like fire catching dry pine. Does that mean you'll take the position? It means I'll try it, she said. If it doesn't work, I'll move on. No hard feelings. He stood, extended a hand. Welcome to Bar C, Nurse Halstead. She placed her hand in his, felt the warmth and weight of it, and something passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but something like possibility. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, in a long time, she wanted to find out. She watched him go, his footsteps quiet down the hall. She looked again at the borrowed dress and touched the edge of her satchel, and she thought, I might not be finished after all. She watched him walk down the hall, his shadow long across the worn floorboards and knew her life had just changed. Again. The trail stretched wide and white, flanked by mountains that looked like old gods sleeping under blankets of snow. The morning sun cast a pale gold sheen across the Wyoming highlands, its rays slipping through bare cottonwoods and shimmering off icy fences. A hard freeze had crusted the snow with a brittle shell, and each step of the horses broke it with a soft crunch. Wind ran low along the valleys, brushing against the riders like a breath half held. The road north from Gallows Creek rolled gently across the plains before dipping into a series of low ridges, each one rising like a question between Clara Halstead and whatever came next. She rode beside Weston Boone, her borrowed coat fastened tight at the collar, a woolen scarf tucked beneath her chin, her hands, still stiff from frostbite days earlier, gripped the reins with caution. She hadn't ridden much back east, not like this, and certainly not beside a man who said little, yet seemed to see everything. They'd been riding for nearly an hour when Weston broke the silence. "See that notch in the ridge yonder?" He pointed to a distant cleft in the hills. "Couple years back, we lost a man up there. Late spring snow, just like this one. Horse slipped, buried him before we could dig out." Clara followed his gesture and nodded, quietly. The land didn't forgive carelessness. It didn't carry grudges either, it simply was. Wide and wind-blown and honest in a way most people weren't. Her satchel, securely strapped to her saddle, bounced slightly with the rhythm of the ride. Inside it were the same worn instruments and folded papers she'd clutched back in the depot. But here on the trail, beneath an open sky, they felt less like relics and more like tools waiting to matter again. Weston spoke now and then, mostly pointing out landmarks, a frozen creek where they watered cattle, a split-rail fence built by hand 3 winters ago, a grove of wind-stunted trees where the hand sometimes camped during roundup. His tone was even, his words spare, but they lingered in the air with weight. Clara listened, answering when needed, sometimes with questions. She didn't ask about his family or his past, not yet, and he didn't pry about hers. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that settled in when both people were thinking about the same thing and didn't need to say it aloud. Around mid-morning, they crested a low hill, and Weston reined in his stallion. "There she is," he said simply. Clara followed his gaze, and her breath caught. The Bar C Ranch spread across the valley like a storybook homestead that had clawed its way out of the dust. The main house stood tall and sturdy, logs fitted snug with chinking, a stone chimney sending up a slow curl of smoke. To the side was a long bunkhouse, a blacksmith shed, several barns, and a corral where horses stood silhouetted against the snow. Beyond that stretched pastures and tree lines, fences and trails, everything stitched together like the seams of a working life. "It's beautiful," she said before she could stop herself. Weston gave a slow nod. "Wait till spring, when the grass comes in and wildflowers take the low fields. That's when it shines." They descended the hill at a steady pace. A few of the men had already noticed their arrival. Faces appeared at barn doors, and someone rang a bell that echoed sharp across the yard. Clara sat straighter in the saddle, suddenly aware of how her borrowed clothes clung tight in the wrong places and how foreign she must look riding beside the boss. As they reached the center of the ranch yard, Weston dismounted with fluid ease, handing the reins to a stable boy who appeared without being called. Clara hesitated, then tried to swing her leg down, but her boot caught in the stirrup. She started to slip, and before she could land hard in the snow. Weston caught her under the arms and steadied her. "Easy," he said, smiling. Takes a little getting used to. I'm used to hospital steps and tiled floors, she muttered. He grinned. We'll get you a horse that mine's better than mine. Voices approached. A lean, weathered man with graying whiskers and sharp eyes strode over and tipped his hat. Tom Bradley, he said. Foreman here. We heard Boone was bringing back a miracle worker. I don't know about that, Clara replied, offering her hand. Clara Halstead. He shook it firmly. We're mighty glad to have you. Miss, Billy over there's been mopin' for 2 days with a busted hand. Wouldn't let nobody touch it. Says he's waitin' on the new nurse. A young man, barely more than a boy, stepped forward holding his bandaged hand gingerly. His face flushed as he mumbled, Ma'am. I'll take a look, she said. After you've had a chance to settle, Weston interjected. Come on, I'll show you your place. He led her toward a small cabin, not far from the main house. The path crunched beneath their boots, and Clara caught the faint scent of baking bread from somewhere, probably the kitchen house. The cabin itself was modest, but well built, with a porch just wide enough for a chair and a woodpile stacked neatly under the eaves. Inside, it was warm. A fire already burned in the hearth, and the simple furnishings gave the space a sense of quiet welcome. A braided rug lay near the stove, quilts folded over a cedar chest, curtains stitched from flowered calico fluttered at the windows. Martha, Cookie's wife, stocked it best she could, Weston said. If you need anything else, just holler. Clara nodded slowly, taking it all in. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. There's one more thing, Weston added. He stepped to a side door and opened it. The room beyond was narrow but bright, a long window on one wall, a wooden counter along the other. In the center stood a medical examination table. Clean linens folded nearby. Cabinets lined the wall, filled with glass bottles, surgical tools, bandages, even a small locked case for laudanum and chloroform. Clara stepped inside, stunned. This must have cost a fortune, she whispered. He shrugged. A good nurse is worth a fortune. I ordered most of it months ago. Was hoping I'd find someone like you to make use of it. She turned, eyes damp, but said nothing. There was a knock at the front door. Tom Bradley entered, supporting young Billy, who limped slightly on one foot. Sorry to bother you, Tom said. But Billy here's been too stubborn to let Cookie take a look. Clara immediately stepped into the medical room, motioning them in. Take off your boot, she said to Billy, who obeyed with some difficulty. The foot was bruised, but not broken. She cleaned the wound, rewrapped it tightly, and gave him strict instructions for rest and elevation. Tom watched from the doorway, arms folded. You sure know what you're doing, he said. I've done worse with less, she replied, wiping her hands, as Billy hopped out the door, grinning despite himself. Clara looked up and caught Weston's gaze from the threshold. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes, a mix of pride and quiet awe, said more than words. And for the first time in years. Clara smiled without hesitation, just before a shadow crossed the barn windows outside. A rider approaching alone. The sun had barely touched the ridge when shouting split the calm of the ranch, followed by the sound no cowboy ever wants to hear, the scream of a panicked horse. Clara Halstead dropped the spoon she'd been stirring with. It clattered to the floor of the kitchen cabin, barely noticed over the commotion beyond the window. Weston was already out the door, his boots pounding against the porch planks. Clara grabbed her coat, her instincts flaring to life as the ranch's quiet morning cracked open like a rifle shot. Moments earlier, the kitchen had been filled with the smell of sourdough and coffee, a peaceful start to a long spring day. Cookie had been humming an old hymn while Martha tended to a pot of stew. Now, everything shifted. Outside, in the main corral, chaos spun like a dust devil, one of the young hands, Denny. She thought lay twisted in the dirt, half buried in kicked-up snow and slush, while a chestnut mare reared and flailed nearby, eyes wild, reins flapping. It took 2 men and a rope to pull her back. Clara was already moving, her boots pounding hard against the packed earth. Weston stood nearby, his hand on Danny's chest, his face tight with concern. "He's breathing, but it's shallow," he said as she knelt beside him. Horse came down on him hard. She didn't need Weston to say it. One glance told her enough crushed ribs, labored breathing, skin already going gray around the lips, blood in the boy's mouth. "We can't wait for a doctor," she said. "We sent for one, but he's in Fort Bridger," Tom Bradley added, kneeling at her side. "Won't get here till tomorrow." "Tomorrow's too late," Clara snapped, pulling off her gloves. She looked around. "We need a flat surface, now, a table, strong, and light as much as you can find." The bunkhouse was closest. Tom shouted orders. 2 men ran to fetch lamps and clean sheets. Others stood frozen, their faces pale. As Clara followed Danny's limp body into the warmth of the bunkhouse and claimed the longest table near the stove. "Get this clear," she barked, swiping away tin plates and playing cards. "Boil water," she added. "Disinfect every knife I brought with me." "Tom, I'll need your hands steady, if you're not up to it. Say so now." "I'm steady," he said. "Tell me what to do." She did, for the next 3 hours. Clara Halstead moved like a conductor in a storm. She cut away Danny's shirt, washed the blood from his ribs, and made a careful incision just below the sternum while Tom kept the lamps fixed on her hands. She worked in silence, save for the murmured names of bones and arteries, her breath shallow as she tried to stitch around the torn lung without slipping. Men crowded the bunkhouse doorway, holding their hats in nervous hands, muttering prayers under their breath. Outside, the wind had died. Even nature seemed to hold its breath. At one point, Danny's pulse faded beneath her fingertips. She paused, fingers hovering mid-air, then leaned in, whispering in the boy's ear. "Come on, sweetheart, fight for me." And he did. Color slowly crept back into his cheeks. The breath came more evenly. Clara wiped sweat from her brow with a corner of her sleeve and tied off the last suture. She wrapped his chest tight with fresh bandages and leaned back only when she was sure his body had stopped its battle. "He'll live," she said simply. The cheer that rose from the bunkhouse was not loud, but it rang with pure relief. Weston, who had been watching from the far end, stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. Weston's eyes met hers, full of questions he didn't yet dare ask. And for the first time, Clara wasn't sure she had the strength to keep the answers buried. His voice was quiet, not accusing, but thick with something else, something more than admiration. Clara didn't answer. She stood, her knees weak, and peeled off the bloodied apron someone had handed her earlier. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the toll of what she'd just done. She'd operated under fire before, during a fever outbreak in Missouri, but never alone, never without backup, and never with so many eyes on her every move. Back in her cabin. The fire had burned low. She sat on the cot, silent. Outside, the ranch was returning to motion. Horses fed. Gates creaked. Men moved with renewed purpose. She heard the door creak. Weston entered quietly, a tin mug of coffee in one hand. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding it out. She accepted it without speaking. The warmth grounded her. "I've seen plenty of wounds," he said. But I ain't never seen what I saw today. You didn't just fix him. You willed him back. It was skill, she said, trying to brush it off, not magic. I beg to differ. Silence fell between them, thick as the rising dusk. He set the coffee down on the nearby table. The boys are asking what to call you now. Miss Halstead don't seem to do justice. I'm still me, she said, still Clara. He nodded. Then he hesitated, eyes lingering on her with unspoken weight. I mean it. Clara, what else are you holding back? She looked at him. Finally. And in her eyes was the reflection of everything she hadn't said about the hospital. The shame, the fear of being forgotten, and the deep ache of having something to offer and nowhere to place it. But her lips didn't speak it. Not yet. I'm tired. Weston, she said instead. He understood. I'll see you in the morning. He turned to go, his boots heavy against the floor. Clara sat on the edge of her cot, shaking. Weston knelt beside her, not speaking at first, only placing a hand on her shoulder with a quiet reverence that said everything he might have spoken. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a red-faced boy too young to read the warning it carried. Clara Halstead stood on the porch of her cabin, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron, the warm scent of fresh cornbread still drifting from her open window. The boy handed her the folded slip, huffing from the ride, cheeks chapped raw by wind. She thanked him quietly and walked back inside without opening it. She knew before she read the words. The weight of the envelope, the tightness in her chest, both were familiar. Trouble always had a certain smell, like old blood on cotton and stale whiskey on a doctor's breath. She stared at the telegram for a long minute before finally tearing it open. Dr. Lowell Finch arriving by rail. Cheyenne docket confirmed. Expected within 4 days. Investigation requested. Territorial Board. Stop. Clara folded the telegram slowly, with deliberate care, and slid it into the bottom drawer of her writing desk, beneath her nursing certificates. The past had found her. Outside. The air was thick with the promise of spring. The first green blades had pushed through the thawing ground, and tiny purple wildflowers dotted the trail toward the stables. Men called to one another across the ranch. Voices lifted not in alarm this time, but in routine. It was a world she had come to know in ways that comforted her, the sound of hammers, the creak of saddle leather, the familiar whistle of the cook calling dinner from the porch. But all of that felt suddenly distant. At lunch, she said nothing about the telegram, not when Martha passed the biscuits, not when Weston brushed her arm while pouring coffee. He noticed her quiet. Of course. Weston noticed everything, but he didn't press not until later. She found him on the far fence line just after dusk, tightening wire and watching the sky fold itself into shades of violet and blue. He looked up when she approached. Something's wrong, he said, not a question. She handed him the folded telegram. His jaw worked as he read, slow and tight. Finch, he muttered. From back east. She nodded. He's not just come to visit. Weston. He's coming for blood. Mine. He can't touch you, he said. He can try. Her voice held a steady note, but her hands, clenched at her sides, betrayed the truth. Weston leaned on the fence post, the rough grain of the wood digging into his palm. Then we'll meet him head-on. Gallows Creek's town square had always seemed to Clara like a place stuck between ages, a blend of dusty ambition and slow decay. The courthouse stood on the south side, its bell tower leaning just enough to make a man uncomfortable, and its doors worn smooth by weather and boots. That morning, Clara rode in beside Weston and Tom Bradley, her satchel strapped to the side of her saddle, her coat buttoned high, She wore her cleanest dress, a simple blue-gray with a high collar, and her hair pinned tight against the wind. Dr. Lowell Finch was waiting for them, standing on the steps like a vulture. He had not changed much, tall and pale. His beard trimmed with surgical precision, eyes sharp and calculating behind gold-rimmed spectacles. He smiled when he saw her, but it was a smile with no warmth. "Miss Halstead," he said, with mock civility. "Mrs. Halstead," Weston said before she could speak. "She works under my name and my protection. You'll address her with respect." Finch ignored him. "I'm here under authority of the Territorial Medical Board," he said, pulling a folded letter from his coat. "There have been concerning reports, unlicensed medical practice, questionable history." Clara didn't blink. "There's nothing questionable about my history. Only men like you who twist it." Finch chuckled softly. "We'll let the court decide." Inside. The old courtroom smelled of paper and linseed oil. The pews were already half filled with curious locals and a few ranch hands who had ridden in early. Clara sat stiff-backed on the bench, while Weston stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on the rail. The hearing began with formalities. The judge, an older man with a deep crease between his eyes and a tobacco stain on his collar, listened with the patience of someone used to cattle disputes, not moral reckonings. Finch began his argument with clipped phrases and polished concern. He painted Clara as a danger unlicensed, unsupervised, and morally suspect. He spoke of her dismissal from St. Margaret's without context, alluding to inappropriate conduct and disciplinary issues. When it was Clara's turn, she stood slowly. Her voice, though quiet, reached every corner of the room. "I was a nurse at St. Margaret's Infirmary in St. Louis, trained, certified. I was dismissed not for incompetence, but for defending myself against assault. I broke a doctor's nose with a bedpan when he cornered me in a supply room. He had friends in high places. I did not." A murmur ran through the crowd. She stepped closer to the judge's bench, holding her satchel in both hands. "I have saved lives on the Bar C Ranch. With these hands, with these tools. Ask the boy I stitched back from the brink just 5 days ago. Ask the men who trust me with their wounds." As if on cue, Tom Bradley stood. "She saved my nephew's life. We had no doctor. If she hadn't acted, he'd be buried by now." Then Cookie's voice rang out. "She treated my Martha's fever when no one else would come." One by one, others stood, cowboys, townsfolk, even the stable hand from the hotel in Cheyenne who had remembered her from the storm. Their voices formed a chorus, steady and unwavering. Even the judge's eyes softened. A quiet fell as the judge looked over the courtroom, then down at Finch. "Do you have any medical record?" he asked. "Of your own dismissal from St. Matthew's in Chicago last year, for drink and other misconduct?" Finch's expression faltered. "That is irrelevant." "On the contrary," the judge said, "it is very relevant." Clara didn't smile. She didn't need to. The gavel came down with a dry, echoing crack. "This court finds no evidence of malpractice, fraud, or misconduct. Clara Halstead's nursing certificates are hereby recognized under Wyoming Territorial Authority. She is authorized to practice medicine under the title of Nurse Halstead throughout this jurisdiction." Applause burst like thunder through the room. Applause swelled. But Clara's ears rang with the echo of Finch's parting stare. This battle was won, but had the war truly ended? Outside, the sun had risen fully above the rooftops, warming the courthouse steps. In the crowd, Finch was already backing away, disappearing into the shadows. In the crowd, Weston stands, then Tom, Then one by one, every ranch hand rises to their feet until Finch is the only man still sitting. Spring brought more than wild flowers. It brought babies, injuries, letters from Boston, and the sound of hammers rebuilding what the past had broken. At the Bar C Ranch. The wind carried the scent of new grass and warm earth, and the cottonwoods were thick with birdsong. The snow had melted down to damp patches along the fence lines, and the river behind the north pasture ran swift and clear. Clara Halstead stood beneath the budding arbor near the main house, her eyes on the chapel cross Weston had carved into the lintel himself. Sunlight spilled through the pale branches overhead, dappling her dress a simple ivory silk trimmed with lace, sewn by Martha's own hand. The trial in Gallows Creek had changed everything. After the judge's ruling, word had spread like fire in a dry field. Letters came in from towns near and far, asking for Clara's help, her guidance, her presence. The courthouse had barely emptied before Weston Boone had taken her by the hand, led her to the bluff overlooking the Bar C Valley, and asked her a single question. "Say yes, and let's build something no storm can take." She had said yes, that morning. The ranch had stirred to life with an energy Clara had never seen. Cookie was up before dawn, preparing the feast. Martha bustled in and out of the kitchen cabin with linens, herbs, and bundles of prairie flowers. Tom Bradley polished his boots and practiced a short speech by the stables, though no one had asked him to. The wedding was to be held on the wide porch of the main house, beneath garlands of wild violets and white sage. Cowboys lined the yard in clean shirts and brushed hats, nervous as children at a county fair. A circuit preacher had arrived at sunrise, dust on his coat and scripture in his satchel. Clara stood in the cabin doorway, her breath shallow with anticipation. Her fingers toyed with a small gold locket Weston had given her that morning inside. A photograph of the two of them taken near the creek last week, and beside it, engraved in fine cursive, "Forever and always, Wanwatsib." Martha touched her arm gently. "It's time." She stepped into the sunlight. The music came from a harmonica soft, lilting played by one of the ranch hands who had volunteered for the task with trembling fingers. Clara walked slowly between rows of her new family, her eyes locked on the man standing at the altar, Weston Boone, in his finest black suit. Freshly shaved, his eyes brighter than she had ever seen them. Tom Bradley offered his arm in place of her father, and she took it with quiet gratitude. The preacher's voice carried over the crowd, steady and sure. "We are gathered here today under the sky that has seen every hardship and every joy, to witness the joining of Weston Calder Boone and Clara Rose Halstead." Clara heard each word clearly, words of commitment, of shelter, of choice, not just chosen once, but again and again. She repeated her vows with a voice as clear as the river and twice as steady. When Weston spoke his, there was a hush that fell over even the birds. "I take you, Clara," he said, "to be my partner through storm and summer, silence and song. What we've built, we'll keep buildin', together." The preacher smiled and gave a slow nod. "By the power granted me by this fine territory," he said, "I now declare you husband and wife." The kiss was tender, fierce, final, and yet, somehow, only the beginning. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the ranch in gold and rose, Clara and Weston sat side by side on the porch, fingers entwined. The cowboys still danced near the bunkhouse, boots tapping out joy across the dirt. Music drifted lazily through the air. Children, some from neighboring ranches, chased one another with ribboned sticks, their laughter like chimes in the warm breeze. "You look like you've seen heaven," Weston murmured, watching her watch the world. "I think I have," she whispered. The Barcy Ranch was changing, not just growing, but deepening. What had once been a man's operation was becoming something more. With Clara came purpose beyond cattle and fence wire. She began to draw up plans for a permanent infirmary, not just a cabin room, but a true medical center that could serve Gallows Creek and the surrounding settlements. A place where women like her could learn, where lives could be saved long after she was gone. They named it St. Winifred's Frontier Infirmary, after Weston's mother, a quiet woman who had taught him how to read and plant gardens, and who had died before Clara ever met him. Together, Clara and Weston began laying the foundation near the south bend of the river. Wood arrived by wagon from Cheyenne, tools from Laramie. Students came, 2 first a trickle, then a steady stream young women with calloused hands and brave hearts, eager to learn the skills Clara had once been denied the right to practice. One of the first was Danny Holcomb, now recovered and eager to repay what had been given to him. He'd taken to assisting Clara in the makeshift surgery room, learning stitches and wound cleaning, becoming her first formal trainee. They rode out together sometimes, Clara and Weston, to neighboring ranches, checking on pregnancies and infected bites, lameness in horses and rot in root cellars. Where once she had walked alone through snow and silence, now she rode beneath sunlight beside a man who knew her truth and honored it with every word, every glance. On one quiet evening, as they stood watching the stars blink into place, Weston pulled something from his coat pocket. "I have something else for you," he said, placing the small velvet box in her palm. She opened it slowly, a gold locket, delicate, etched with trailing vines. "Open it," he urged. Inside, on one side, was the photograph from that morning, her in white, him beside her, both looking stunned and smiling. On the other side, a simple inscription, "Forever and always." "Sabi." Clara's throat tightened. "Now you'll always have me close to your heart," he said softly. She closed the locket gently, resting her hand over it. "I already do," Clara whispered, then kissed him under the star-filled Wyoming sky. Years later, they would point to this day not as the beginning of a love story, but as the moment when 2 broken pasts made a single, unbreakable whole. Years later, a traveler would ask where the story began, and the old ranch hands would point toward the snow-worn tracks beyond Dry Post Station and say, "Right there, where a woman didn't give up." Sometimes, when the sun dips low and the prairie turns the color of old copper, a story lingers in the wind long after it's been told. And if you sit real still, real quiet, you might just hear its footprints fading down the trail, like the soft scuff of a woman's boot, or the gentle breath of a horse that's seen too much and spoken too little. And the wind. Oh, the wind, it don't forget what folks try to bury. Not ever. Not truly. For the land remembers, and so do we. A cracked leather satchel, worn but proud, resting on a shelf in some little museum in Cheyenne, next to a gold locket that still catches the light, just so. Beside a name carved into the wood of an old cabin door, Halstead, nurse, wife, builder of hope, bringer of quiet justice. And if you were lucky enough to walk that ranch in early spring, you might find violets blooming near the infirmary porch, the same kind that once crowned her hair the day she said yes to a man who carried his scars like medals, who built fences with his hands and foundations with his heart. And maybe you'd hear the creak of a weathered swing, or the soft clink of enamel mugs in the twilight, or the hush of voices carrying names that still mean something. Clara, Weston, Tom, Martha, Danny, and maybe you'd pause, just for a moment, at the edge of the story, and feel what they left behind, not just the love, but the weight of it, the cost of it, the simple fact that justice doesn't ride fast, but it does ride sure, and when it arrives. It looks nothing like vengeance, and everything like peace, and in the quiet you might recall the soft glint of a locket opened beneath a prairie moon, or the resolute lift of a chin as a woman walked into a courthouse with nothing but her truth, and a hand-carved satchel full of courage, or the way a cowboy, long past his prime, still straightened his back when he said her name, not out of duty, but reverence, honor. See, it don't always come wrapped in medals or written in ledgers. It comes sometimes in the way a man stands beside a woman when the whole world aims to silence her, in the way a nurse sews flesh and dignity together with the same thread, in the way a forgotten woman tends a land that once forgot her back, and forgiveness, that slow bloom, that weather-worn mercy. It crept into their lives like a sunrise in late March, unhurried, undeniable, wrapping around the bones of old pain and asking nothing in return but room to grow. And though the town changed, though fences shifted and roads paved and machines came and went, the story held firm. Not in books, not in signs, but in the whisper of cottonwoods, in harmonica notes drifting across dusk, in the scent of pine soap on an old quilt, in a single porch light flickering against the night like someone's still waiting up. Because the truth, friends. It doesn't always need a crowd to believe in it. Sometimes it just needs one soul brave enough to carry it forward, to protect it from rot, to wrap it in cloth and keep it close, even when it seems the whole world's forgotten. And so, if your hands have grown calloused from holding silence too long, if your story's been twisted or buried or left out in the cold, take heart in knowing there was once a woman who stood in the snow, teeth chattering, past in tatters, and was offered not pity, but a place, a job, a coat, a future, and a home, and she took it, and she turned it into legend, and maybe, just maybe, you're not too far gone to do the same, so if you believe honor still matters, even when it's late in coming, if you believe the forgotten deserve a second look, and that some stories quiet as they are deserved to be told, leave a mark, even if it's just a simple one below, and if you've ever known the ache of carrying a truth no one wanted to hear, let this be your reminder you're not alone, not in this world, not in this wind. And if this story touched something in you, if it stirred a memory or a hope or a flicker of something lost, follow the sound of the next tale and join us again at Westwind Whispers, where the fire's still warm, the coffee's still strong, and the past still speaks low and slow, like hoofbeats across the hardpan, like breath through chapped lips, like a promise carved into the sky.